Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Schmiesing. I'm the Vice Provost for Outreach and Engagement here at The Ohio State University. First, I'd like to welcome you to the Provost Discovery Themes Lecture, where we have Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom speaking with us this afternoon. Since the Provost Discovery Themes Lecture program began in 2014, we have had an illustrious list of speakers give thought-provoking lectures on a variety of topics, and I think you'll find today is no different. Ohio State's Discovery Themes initiative connects and builds on the expertise across all of our campuses, engaging interdisciplinary teams to accelerate discovery and create practical solutions to some of the world's most pressing challenges. The Provost Discovery Themes Lecture program invites prominent speakers to discuss those challenges. Through these lectures, we hope to engage each of you in conversations on these critical topics here at the university and in our communities. Before we move on, I want to acknowledge the team in outreach and engagement that has worked on this program the last 6 months or so, and also acknowledge my colleagues at the university who served on the planning team to select Dr. Cottom to speak with us today. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you and welcome the Executive Vice President and Provost, Bruce McFerrin.
Thanks so very much, Ryan. And thanks to each and every one of you for joining us today for what promises to be a very interesting lecture. As Ryan said, we've had an extraordinary sequence of presentations on a variety of subjects over these past years. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom as our Discovery Themes lecturer. Dr. Cottom's an award-winning author, researcher, educator, and cultural critic whose work has been recognized nationally and internationally for the urgency and depth of her incisive critical analysis of technology, higher education, class, race, and gender. Dr. Cottom's an associate professor at the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill School of Information and Library Science, a senior faculty researcher with the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, also at Chapel Hill, and a faculty affiliate at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. She was also named a 2020 MacArthur Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Tressie McMillan Cottom. Dr. Cottom?
Thank you so very much, Provost McFerrin. I've got to start with some thank yous and then maybe just one or two receipts. Okay, so here are my thank yous. I have to thank Judy and Jason, who have done an amazing job of pulling off this event and making it very easy for me to be here with you today. And listen, that is tough under normal circumstances. And I think, as we all know, these are not even normal circumstances. So kudos to them for a brilliantly organized and orchestrated event. And again, my thanks to Provost McFerrin and also to Brian for that lovely introduction and warm welcome to the Ohio State. And I have to thank everyone involved with the Discovery Lecture Planning Committee, and a special thank you to Professor Wendy Smooth, who hosted a wonderful discussion with me and some fellow faculty members earlier today. Now here comes the receipt. Here's the thing. When we first started talking about me visiting the university, I said, oh, that's so exciting. I've been wanting to visit campus, and I had intended to book a couple of extra days to explore the area. And I just want to make it very clear that this event in no way satisfies that obligation to me. I still fully expect an invitation to actual campus just as soon as it becomes feasible and safe to do so. So I just wanted to make sure I put that out there. I don't know if that's the provost's responsibility, Bruce, but just in case, you should know that I'm still looking forward to that on-campus invitation. Let's see, so this year's Discovery Lecture theme is data and race. And as the provost mentioned, my understanding of what this lecture series does is put forward some of the most pressing challenges before an interested, inquisitive, curious and engaged audience. And that just happens to be one of my favorite things to do. So I'm going to hopefully have a really good time here with you today. It is unfortunate for me that I cannot see your faces, but you should know that I'm imagining them. And in my mind's eye, this audience is full of fresh-faced, bright eyes, with open hearts and minds, ready to think creatively, collaboratively about some of the most pressing challenges facing us today, particularly as they relate to data and race. I may be biased when I say I don't think that there is a more vital, intersectional topic, and I use intersectional in the sense of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, but also collaborative, and also calling out to intersectionality. But I use it in the very broad sense. I can't think of a more vital intersectional topic in all of US public life right now than the one that we can have at the intersection of race and data. I also think that this is a fortuitous time for us to be having that conversation. We have, I think, as a public, as a society, as a nation, experienced over the last few months just how critical data and race are to the vitality of US civic and public life, right? We've basically seen data reanimated in the streets, in our political debates, in our political conflict, I think in our personal lives, in the very challenging conversations we are having about how we live in a multiracial society that is also an information-based, digitally mediated society. Whether you are on the chat boards or you're on Reddit or you're on Twitter or you are on Facebook, my first provocation to you today is that whether you are in those spaces or not, the last few months have shown us that whether we participate in the digital society or not, we are living in the digital society. We are living with its consequences and with its effects. This is no longer, if it has ever been, a conversation for the margins of public life. This is no longer a conversation only for experts. This is a conversation about the soul, the heart, and the mind of the US project. So this is the time that we're in when I think we've all awakened to that fact and to that reality. Across the nation, data-driven approaches to elections, for example, are posing real challenges to gerrymandering. We are now 7 years after the Voting Rights Act was effectively gutted, which in turn jeopardized the full franchise of African-American voters. We know that a data society matters. Data, especially social science data, has also played a vital historical role in the struggle for full citizenship for all people in the United States, but in particular through the stories and the experiences of African Americans, Latinx, Asian American, and Indigenous communities and citizens. And I was thinking about the intersection of data and race and how it can feel like when we talk about data and race, what we mean is the internet, right? Or we mean something like Facebook or social media. Data does predate the internet, you know. So the intersections of data and race has what a fellow sociologist of mine often talks about, the historical sediments of race, capitalism, and inequality. Those historical sediments of the intersections of data and race predate the internet. And we're going to get to the internet in a moment, but I thought it was important for us to start with maybe a historical lens and view of just how critical the intersections of data and race are. Perhaps the most famous instance of how important the intersection of data and race are. And you may already know this example, and if you do, you just keep it to yourself, just like we do in the classroom, and you let the other students for whom this is new information come to the fore. And that is the role of experimental data in the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case. Now, Brown versus Board is, of course, the case that finally bookends this nation's legal segregation, legal apartheid system in the United States of America. It happens through the integration of public schooling, but it was really about the integration of all of public life and public resources. In the Brown versus Board of Education case, doctors Kenneth and Mamie Clark, renowned psychologists, African-American psychologists, and their research is foundational to the case that is made before the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board. Their research on discrimination showed the negative effect of segregation on Black school-age children, through showing how the children interacted with racialized dolls. So they give them Black and white dolls. This is the infamous doll test. And the children at a very young age can ascribe personality traits, morality, value, and worth to the dolls based on the racial signifiers of the dolls. Right? And this experiment and the data from this experiment, the Clarks use that to build a case for the Supreme Court that says that racial segregation is harmful to Black children and by extension to Black Americans, that it causes knowable, observable harm. So in this instance of the intersection of data and race, a Supreme Court decision that would finally end the moral scourge of legally sanctioned racial apartheid in the United States of America hinged in large part on the legibility of data that could not only describe, but predict the experiences of race and racism. Now, what is most commented upon in our retelling of this moment, usually, if you learn about this in class or from PBS specials, of which there are many, we usually focus on the experiment where the Clarks give the children the dolls because there's video of it. It is a visceral experience watching that video. It is still to this day, 60 years after that particular iteration of the doll test experiment, really powerful to watch. It's because the harm is so tangible, and evocative. What is less commented upon that I want to focus on for a moment is how the Clarks also presented to the Supreme Court what must have been one of the best literature reviews ever written in the history of mankind. If you read the Supreme Court's decision, yes, they call out the doll experiment, but they also call out to the Clarks' summation of cutting-edge empirical data on the cause and effect of race-based discrimination. And so this is where I like to tell all of the graduate students and the junior scholars in the virtual room that the lesson here is never underestimate the power of a really good literature review. Okay. My colleague and good friend, sociologist Maricela Martinez Cola, is also a legal scholar, and she studies the Brown versus Board decision. She's an overachiever. She's both a former attorney and a PhD in sociology, and her recent work on the Brown versus Board of Education focuses on what she calls the bricks before Brown. And these are the cases that involve Chinese American, Mexican American, Native American, and Indigenous plaintiffs, each of them making an appeal to the courts for their legibility as citizens. And in each of these cases, one of the things that Maricela shows is how in each of these instances, the plaintiff uses data to make themselves legible either as a racialized subject or a non-racialized subject, to try to lay legitimate claim to their inclusion in US public life. We might say that they coded themselves and their stories of belongingness and citizenship, not unlike, I will argue, the way we code citizenship and belonging in the platforms and the software that shapes the modern digital society. So you see, there's this long history of the intersection of race and data, where being legible, coding yourself, being able to decode what the expectations of authorities are about race and data, that your ability to do that is foundational to who will be included in the US social contract. So race and data have a long, complicated history in US public and civic life. And all of that was before the internet. Now, I'm probably here in part because I am associated with work that I do on and about the internet. I am affiliated, as the provost mentioned, with Berkman Klein Center, the Center for Data and Society. My principal post at UNC is with the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. And so here's the strange thing. Despite all of that, I am terribly, maybe even infamously agnostic about the internet. I get in a lot of trouble when I say that around some of my colleagues, but reality is I don't care about the internet that much. I mean, you know, it's a fine thing. I certainly use it. It has brought some level of efficiency to my life, as I'm sure it has yours. But the internet in and of itself doesn't really do it for me intellectually. I get there's some wires under the ocean, there's some signals, there's some binary code, ones and zeros. I get all of that. Let me tell you what I do care about a lot. I care a great deal, both professionally and personally, about what the internet and everything that comes with it, the politics, the economics, the culture, the norms, the behaviors, the incentives. I care a lot about how that transforms the most basic unit of social life. And because I'm a sociologist and not per se a psychologist or a cultural anthropologist or an economist, I think the basic unit of social life is social interaction, right? Yeah, some people would say it's identity. It's not untrue, it's just not my level of analysis. I think that our lives are made, ourselves are made in our interactions with each other. And so that's what I get really excited about, what I hope you will be really excited about by the end of this talk. And that is a way to think about the digital society that accepts all of the inferences we can make based on what we know about the internet, but that does not stop at the internet. That does not even make the internet the center of our conversation, that instead centers people and interactions and social life. My driving intellectual project, whether it's in monographs or articles, essays or podcasts, public engagement or teaching, is how a big monster like technology rewrites the social contract. And I generally get at that question by starting with the metaphors we tell ourselves about mobility and who can be upwardly social mobile in our society. And now those are really big stories, and the stories can be so big that we don't think much about them, right? We inherit them, we get sort of steeped in them. And even when the story of work hard, delay childbirth, get married, don't go into debt, go to college, doesn't work out in our own lives, as evidenced by greater economic security or more social mobility or greater status, we still tend to believe in them. That's the power of a metaphor. That's the power of the stories that we tell about mobility. I trace those stories, and I think more importantly, I question them, question how true they are. And I do that because, well, it makes me fun at dinner parties. Not really. Nobody likes the person who pokes holes in their ideologies at the dinner party. It really does not. I go anyway, but I'm not sure it makes me very popular. But I do it because in those metaphors, I can find the conflict between our idealized self as a society and our actual society, how we are actually living. And in an information society such as ours, where data has upended every social system, every social institution, the metaphors of mobility that I poke at, right, can tell us really important stories about data and race. Doing so, to me at this point, is as American as apple empanadas, which I prefer to apple pie. And so I'd like to talk to you a bit about what I do care about and how that shapes my research and teaching agenda. And I'm going to invite you into a little collaborative course prep with me. So as my economist friends would say, there's no free lunch. All right, so here's where you do a little work with me. Okay, so I'm presently teaching a graduate seminar called Networks of Racial Capitalism. And the name could be many things, but you got to choose one for the catalog, and that's the one I have. And in that course, we wrestle with many of the things I'm wrestling with here with you today in this talk: the intersection of race and capitalism and platforms. That's where I would like us to talk next. I want to talk a little bit about platforms and how much they shape social life, and as a consequence, how much they shape our understanding and experience of race, racism, and mobility. Scholars from a range of fields consider information society one where platform is king, right? The platform is king. Now, you know what a platform is, even if you don't really think about them very often. They think about you. You touch a platform multiple times a day, every single day. All of us do. You wake up, if you use your phone now for an alarm, I'm using mine right now for a timer so I don't go over, right? You are interacting with a platform. Those are the ones that you probably think of first: social media platforms, right? Facebook, Twitter, depending on your age, TikTok, depending on how much free time you have. You might be on Clubhouse or YouTube. But here's the thing about platforms and why so many academics and scholars and researchers and activists argue that platforms are the defining challenge of our information society: understanding them, reckoning with them, and making them more transparent. Platforms are not just about entertainment, right? Nick Cernick, in his book Platform Capitalism, and his subsequent work in this area, which is really foundational, argues that even infrastructure firms, natural resource firms, and corporations are also platforms. Boeing, John Deere, General Electric, some big examples, right? We think of them as like old school, big bureaucratic organizations like IBM, the type of organization that the whole mid-20th century was built upon. But what Nick and others have shown is that when you pull back the lid on those companies, what you find underneath it is a platform. Their business model is not that different from Uber or Amazon or Instacart. You'd think they're selling, let's take, for example, the case of Boeing, airplanes. But Boeing actually doesn't just want to sell an airplane. It wants to sell the software on the airplane, right? In the same way, General Electric wants to maybe sell you a washer and dryer. Have you purchased a household appliance lately? You know what your household appliances are doing in your home. The way that purchasing the appliance puts you into General Electric's platform, right? That's why they play all that music, make all that noise. You had to input all this data, connect it to your household internet, right? Another good example comes in how we interact just in daily life in retail, right? If you don't think that platforms have touched you, have you tried to make a purchase at a grocery store recently without one of those consumer loyalty cards, right? One case that is famous with many of my students is the beauty retailer Ulta is infamous for this. If you try to buy something without signing up for their points rewards card, they almost won't let you buy it, right? Now think about that. I have stood there at the register saying to them, I don't want to sign up for it. I'll pay full price for the item, and have been told, we would rather you sign up and get the discount than have you purchase the item, right? That is, they would rather you walk away from the purchase then refuse to give them your data that will put you into their platform. That to me is the essence of the platform economy. You are more valuable as data than you are as a customer. Okay. And that's true for all of us. That's how we are living now. We are all living in that platform capitalism and what it means. But as is true in the case of all things at the intersection of race and capitalism, we are all not living it the same way. That's where I think the most pressing questions about data and platforms and race emerge. And I'm not the only one. I'd like to call out here to scholars like Ruha Benjamin, Sophia Noble, Amber Hambleton, Andre Brock, Lisa Nakamura, and Alondra Nelson, among many others, who have been arguing for quite some time that the questions about inequality in our society cannot be fully understood if we do not understand how race and data and platforms co-create each other, much in the way you cannot get capitalism without the invention of race. They go together like peanut butter and jelly, perhaps, right? So we know from some of that work that race and racism are really profitable forms of data for platforms. And I'm just going to call out one example from Ruha Benjamin's work in the New Jim Code, where she talks about an algorithm that is designed to predict which ex-prisoners are most likely to commit another crime, their recidivism likelihood, and how that algorithm has wrongly predicted who should be arrested and who is more likely to re-offend. That it more likely flags Black defendants and is less likely to flag white defendants as future criminals. That's Ruha's excellent work. And I want to go a little further here to say that that algorithm does not just do that sort of racialized pattern making for us, that has that historical sediment of what we think is normal and natural about race and racism. But this is how the platform extends into our lives, even if we're not in the platform. The platform itself is judged successful by how well it flags Black defendants. It becomes valuable to police departments and to municipal bodies who make the contracts with the companies who produce these platforms. They are judged successful by how well they flag in ways that recreate the non-platform realities of race and racism. We are all part and parcel of that process as a political process, whether we ourselves are in that recidivism platform or not. In my work, I think a lot about how platforms reproduce inequalities beyond the platform, because again, the internet doesn't really do it for me. And I think that the real power of the platform is that you do not have to be an active participant in it to be disciplined by it. And so I think some of the most engaging and important work is yet to be done. And that is how the platform economy has become this totalizing system, right? You cannot escape it. It isn't an option. The racialization of people and processes happens for everyone, both on and off the platform. I'll talk a little bit about how that's shown up in some of my work. And so in my first book, Lower Ed, I studied for-profit colleges like the University of Phoenix and Strayer, et cetera. And these schools disproportionately enroll Black and Hispanic students, particularly women. And they did that so successfully and efficiently by targeting using data-driven algorithms and advertising protocols to efficiently target women of color. And that targeting happened through platforms like social media and web searches like Google. But that targeted algorithm also had a powerful second order effect. I'm going to talk about the second order effect, because this for me is where the complicated challenge and messiness of race and data really starts to get both interesting and vital to questions of inequality. A for-profit college marketing executive described that second order effect to me in great detail. He said that the more the system, which we might call like a platform college, it was a college built on a platform. He said the more that platform knew about the student it had found through targeted marketing, the more they knew about the people in that student's network. He said, Tressie, a student is valuable to us as potential tuition revenue, but they're really valuable to us for what data they give us about the other people in their lives who we can then potentially target to enroll. That was the powerful second order effect of the data platform. The second order effect made every potential student twice as valuable than they would be as just a tuition stream alone. They were a conduit for identifying other people who were similar to them in race, social class, gender, and economic need and precarity. The second order effect of platforms is where race and data and inequality are presently reproducing without any sort of language or governing structure for us to understand it. In my current study of how people use social media platforms to hustle, right? Everybody's a hustler online, or what we might call micro entrepreneurs. I get a window into this second order effect of the platform power. These micro entrepreneurs don't generate enough money to be considered a small business by all of the typical standards. They're often really just juggling multiple hustles online and offline, trying to make ends meet. And what we are seeing in that data when we talk to these micro entrepreneurs is that they use platforms like Instagram, Facebook, to build their business. But when they are building their businesses, because they start with such little investment capital to begin with, it's self-racialized and gendered and social class, they are using those platforms both in their personal lives and in their business lives. And so for the platform, let's take Instagram and PayPal as an example. They may go on Instagram, build up their reputation and their brand, start to sell some things to other people on Instagram by sending them a link to PayPal for them to make the transaction. Well, those types of payment platforms don't lend themselves well to people delineating their online life from their offline life. So every time they send out a Cash App link or a PayPal link, these micro entrepreneurs who are disproportionately women and women of color open up their entire lives, data lives, to the platform in a way that not only makes them vulnerable, but makes everyone in their household vulnerable, right? This maps onto the very bodies that have always been really powerful as sites of extraction for capitalism, women and people of color. Because entrepreneurs with more resources are more legible to government and to banks, business to business services, they aren't using Cash App the way micro entrepreneurs are, and therefore aren't trapped in the platform the same way women and people of color are. So I think we've only begun to tackle the full picture of how platform capitalism is reconstituting the contours of race and racism. And indeed, I think the scoping of the scale of this phenomenon is one of the most important issues of governance, public life, and democracy. And I'm not overstating this. I'm quite serious when I say, if every time you hear someone say the word app or platform, you instead think the word economy or citizenship, then I think you'll come to the same conclusion I have come to. And that is the point. Platforms have become the economy. Platforms have become governance. They are the structure of how we work, how we vote, how we live. They are not just a response to racial inequality, who has access to the internet or not, who can afford to be on what app, who gets surveilled or not, as important as those questions are. These mechanisms, these platforms are now how racial inequality is produced. And nothing is more vital to understanding our present day society than understanding that relationship. Okay, so in conclusion, I want to go back to the Clarks for a minute, because in thinking about their work in Brown versus Board, I wondered, what our literature reviews about a platform economy, a digital society would look like. What work would we do to lay out the case to a 21st century Supreme Court that's deciding the next landmark case about who is and is not included in the body politic? How would we lay out the case against discrimination, bias, and injustice in a society organized around platforms? Are we yet up to the task? Have we developed the language, the discourse? Are we equipped in public life to talk about with sophistication and nuance how platforms are shaping the everyday basic unit of social life? That is who we are and how we interact with each other. Our challenges are particular. The platform economy is defined in part by its ability to obfuscate how they work. We have a cultural challenge, namely that we haven't yet developed the language to talk about this in public discourse. And then we have, I think, our own inertia to work against. And that's the inertia that leadens our feet when we should be rushing into the stories that we tell ourselves about how progressive or equal we are, when all evidence at the intersection of data and race tell a story to the contrary. So I'm cheered by really good, important work, and I could not leave you here today without telling you wonderful news like that Alondra Nelson, the social scientist and sociologist I mentioned earlier, previous president of the Social Science Research Council, has now been appointed to the deputy director of the Office of Science and Technology in the Biden administration. Nobody knows better than Alondra Nelson the contours of many of the questions and the challenges I've laid out here before you today. And I am cheered that we are now able to start talking, or at least thinking about developing that language and discourse. Her placement is indicative of the kind of sea change I think we have to undergo in public life to challenge what Ruha Benjamin calls the new Jim Code and what I call the hustle economy, the political economy that shapes everything from our identities to our mobility. Is a society increasingly defined by platforms, whether we are in them or not. And I'll end there with a call for critical data literacy and develop a richer public discourse around data and race, of which this conversation is a really important part of. Thank you.
Wow, Tressie, you would be surrounded by applause right now. You're going to have to struggle with just my pathetic little clapping here. But as we sort of turn to a discussion of some of the questions coming from the audience, a lot to think about there. I want to get to some of the things that the folks who've joined us have put forward. But let me just say that as a researcher and a teacher, I wrote a lot of things down, my friend, but I wrote down, never underestimate the power of a literature review.
Never, never. If that is our primary takeaway, then I will be pleased.
Well, it was certainly one of the takeaways for me. And what a terrific reminder, because the arguments we make, we're actually engaged here at Ohio State in a series of public conversations that the president has organized. We're meeting every Thursday night and having a conversation about how to have respectful discussions, how to listen to what other people have to say, what the implications of all of these converging societal and public health revolutions, if you will, are having on us. And, I think it's really important to remember that we build on the thinking of the past. We're not constrained by it. But we're laying a foundation. We're pouring footers that are going to support an awful lot of heavy weight into the future. And we dare not forget that all of our practice is built on discovery and scholarship. And that is, we have to honor the thinking of the past. Maybe especially, I almost said even, but maybe especially the thinking that we don't necessarily agree with.
Absolutely.
You got to see those perspectives. So thank you for, I'll start with a thanks to just thank you for raising that as an issue. let me jump into a couple of things, and I'm going to try and get to as many of these as I can. They're starting to come in. Folks, those of you in the audience, use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen, and Ryan and others are helping me in the background try to make sure I catch as many of these. I love this one from Samantha. Your comment about capitalism and race going together like peanut butter and jelly.
Mm-hmm.
Would you make the argument that one cannot exist without the other?
Absolutely. I draw here, speaking, Bruce, of the scholarship on which our own engagement is built. I am drawing here on the very rich tradition of W.B. Du Bois, Cedric Robinson, and then contemporary scholarship, Gargi Bhattacharya, for example, Lisa McNamara, but many people who have made both the empirical and the theoretical case that racism and capitalism are mutually constitutive, right? As a historical point, a point in the development of the history of capitalism, that they emerge at the same time because they need each other at the same point in time in the political economy. And I don't think we have any reason to think that we have departed from that moment in history. I don't think there has been a historical break in that political economy. And so I'm absolutely building on that work to say that, yes, you cannot have one without the other, which is part of my argument of if you want to understand capitalism, if you want to understand the economy writ large, if you want to understand economic life, you actually cannot do that without an equally fleshed out and theorized understanding of how race and racism have been implicated in capitalism. So yes, absolutely. I did not say that lightly, even though I perhaps said it blithely. They do go together like peanut butter and jelly.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think, again, reflecting back on that history and understanding, we often quote things about failure to understand or consider it, we're doomed to repeat. But our growth also, we can say it in a very prospective way that the growth that we need to see actually requires us to really understand that deep history and the codependencies of so many of these different things. Interesting question from Karima. She wants to know, with your discussion about platform capital, how does that intersect with upward mobility and wealth? What are the effects on the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, particularly in her key interest is in influencing and maybe owning culture?
Oh, yeah, that is a wonderful question. There's a lot of important work, a lot of it done by Black economists about the role of intellectual property in who is allowed to own culture and cultural production. So like there's so you can take sort of like that economic approach. And if you take that economic approach in that literature, the short answer is there has always been a high and significant burden to non-white creators' ability to own their intellectual property and to benefit from it financially to the same extent that white capital is able to benefit from those ideas. I mean, it's just a long historical trajectory of intellectual property either being cordoned off and not being, the owners of it not being afforded the full control of that ownership, or there not being a consumer or investor market willing to value it the same. So like that's the economic piece. On the cultural side of things, the influence culture is fascinating to me. I'm working right now on a paper, and we have an open call out, by the way. I should bring this to your attention. Data and Society. I am co-organizing with some colleagues, Lena Schwartz and Sarita Amrute at Data and Society, a working group on what we are calling the hustle economy. And a real key part of that is how influencer culture is used as a form of managing precarity, economic precarity. So this idea that you can build enough sort of creative capital that will translate into status, that will translate into economic opportunities and investment, right? Like that's the idea of the hustle. We, however, don't see a lot of empirical evidence to bear that out. And one of I think our earlier arguments, and certainly a line of inquiry for us, is how much real capital is there in the influencer culture of the social media economy? And if there's no actual economic capital, how do we understand ownership and property and ideas? Based on your question, you probably know as well as I do that almost every other week, there is a very contentious debate about who owned what dance, or who owned what music, or who owned what idea that seemed to emerge out of this influencer culture. And I think in part, we've got that really fuzzy ownership because of the historical legacies of what is considered intellectual property. And that as long as some of that influencer culture is shaped by and implicated in racialization, that is, that activity is seen as the work of young queer people of color, which it often is, that it will be devalued and won't be legally protected in the way that intellectual property is offline. But those are very interesting questions. So my early answer is we don't yet know. We don't even have, I think, the full methodological tools to figure it out. That's something we're working on. But my instinct is that we will find that part of the lack of regulation and enforcement of ownership in those spaces are due to how the work is coded as racialized and gendered work.
The thread of your answer there, Tressie, actually reminds me of something that you were talking about in the moment here, where you talked about just the exposing of one's life when you use some of these tools. And so it seems to me, am I hearing you correctly, that we're at a point in time where there's this tension between going out there and essentially, if you will, being an entrepreneur in this space and developing your brand and trying to market it, and the risk that you have. And we actually don't really understand even yet, if I'm hearing you correctly, what the potential benefits might be. We know that it could be better, but we're kind of trapped at the moment in this tension.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that we haven't figured out all of those things is not entirely due to our not asking the questions. One of the defining characteristics that I mentioned in the talk of platform capitalism is just how opaque it is. Right? It's marked by how not transparent it is. It is deliberate that we don't know the actual value of a tweet, right? It is deliberate that we cannot measure the impact or reach of our data online, right? You don't know how much you've really given up to the grocery store when you sign up for the discount card, right? That is not transparent. That's not opaque by accident. And that is actually one of the real challenges. Is how both governance has lagged and our own demand for transparency has lagged among the public, because we don't understand it as being central to our economic and political life. I think as we understand it as such, right, that we understand that you're not just giving up your email address, right? You're giving up the pictures that your kid emails you, right? If you thought about how every trace of your own data also exposes your children, also exposes your loved ones, right? I think we would think very differently about what we expect of platforms and of governance to defend our data as well as we expect it to defend our vote or our right. Yeah.
That kind of leads to a question that just popped up seconds ago from Kylie about, can you tell, and this is getting to a specific example, and we may want to go there, or you may want to go a different direction, but she's asking, can you talk about the implications of Clubhouse and their recent announcement of achieving a 1 billion, that's a B, folks, valuation, $1 billion valuation, as she points out from her perspective, while significantly profiting off the intellectual labor of Black folks who've taken over that app in small ways. And how do you balance somebody is actually doing something with this, making and achieving gain out of it, and golly, it's just, I think you're highlighting for us just how complicated the world has become.
Yes, it is. It has become complicated, and I'm very empathetic to how overwhelming that feels? I feel overwhelmed by it, often. I love this question in part because I get to cheat a little. That is our case in class this past week. So I love the Clubhouse example because it is one of the few examples where
Do you have a Kylie in your class?
I was just about to say that may be one of my students who's looking for a head
for
up.
the answer, right?
That's right. Let's see. So, Kylie, you're right on target here. Clubhouse is one of those examples that we just don't see a lot in public. That's why it's sort of an exciting case where we can see in real time how the financial class, investors, speculators, value something as intangible as a social media platform. And we don't always get to see that in real time. And we have, I think, become sophisticated enough to know that something's being exchanged. When Facebook was first developing, we had no way of even understanding what its growth or value meant. Now I think we know. We know that something is being traded for that valuation. And one of the things that we're debating in class is why would a Black user be so much more attractive as a commodity to investors than a non-Black user? And I think there are a couple of answers to that, all of them equally good and generative. One answer is precisely because that user will have less political power to defend their intellectual property on the platform, right? That's a user that cannot call up their congressperson or senator, can't call up their IP lawyer, won't have the sort of collective political power to push back on what they are contributing to the platform at a moment when we are starting to think about those things. And then there's also that long history of how the idea of Blackness is a commodity for how cool a consumer good is or a website is, that it does lend a certain amount of cultural credibility and value to the platform. But the important question is whether or not any of that accrues to the actual users, right? And no, so far it does not.
I'm going to bend just a little bit here because I think this is a really interesting question and actually harkens back to your example of data before the internet, cloud versus board. Nicole is asking, we've just this week, we're nearing the end of day 3 of our return to campus component, but most of our classes remain virtual.
Yeah.
So, how does the intersection of data and race affect pedagogy? There have been lots of questions about some of the tools. We're on Zoom today. I interact with representatives of some companies that actually will not use Zoom as their tool.
Yeah.
So any thoughts on that?
I think it is fascinating which tools we allow which groups of people. And this moment, our sort of a national response to COVID and the shutdowns and particularly public education have revealed, something that many of us already knew, but I think it's revealed how stark it is, what we are willing to unleash in schools and onto students that we would not accept for any other consumer group or political interest group in this country. That we unleash Zoom into public school systems, for example, without considering things like the right to privacy, who owns the content produced in Zoom, where it would be stored, using what protocols. Zoom would have never, for example, passed basic muster with anybody's IRB. And yet somehow in our pedagogical practices, we consider it, an open season. And some of that is due to how ill-equipped we are to have conversations with the people who make platforms about what role they're supposed to fulfill. Are platforms supposed to provide us just a service, a point of sale exchange, or are they responsible for the politics and the economics that get introduced through their platform? That's the debate. So Zoom sees its position as, listen, we allow you to see each other and to talk. That's all we're supposed to do, right? And they are right in the most narrow sense, because we have not set up a form of governance and regulation that makes them responsible for any of the other parts of servicing the platform. That's the part where I think it's actually ironic that the very spaces where we are fomenting critical conversations about these questions are the very places where we've been least critical about adopting the platforms themselves. It's deeply ironic, shaped by the economics. Of course, every university is cash strapped and having to think in very basic terms about budgets. And so that's made us very susceptible to conversations that platforms would rather we not have. But the university and pedagogy is, for me, ground zero for the critical data literacy we're all going to have to develop if we are going to engage in this very complex digital society.
Yeah, I think there are just so many questions, and I suspect that at UNC you're having the same kind of conversation we
Absolutely.
are here at Ohio State about, what have we learned in these last 10 months? What have we learned that we never want to replicate? And
Mhm.
what have we learned that we absolutely must take forward? And I think you've just introduced a really important additional question. What have we learned we don't know enough about
Yes.
to actually
Right.
compartmentalize one way or another? And
Yeah.
I think that's actually a pretty powerful thing for us to be thinking about as we think about, what the new normal in higher education will look like. That hopefully has an influence on K-12 and
Mhm.
pre-K and up and down the food chain in terms of knowledge acquisition.
Absolutely. That role, that vital role of leadership in shaping the entire educational experience uh, is particularly salient and important at public land grant institutions. I mean, that's what we're here to do, and that's why I think it is important that of anyone else, we should be shaping the terms of those conversations and creating spaces for us to develop the language and talk about them. That it is probably more important in our spaces than it is even in political life, because we really influence that as well.
Hmm. Yeah, indeed, indeed. Now, I'm going to back up just a second here. You opened this door, and I'm going to walk through it.
Okay.
You use platforms and governance in the same sentence.
Yeah.
So I'm going to call out Steve's question from very early on while you were still speaking. And he asked the question, if platforms have become governance,
Mm.
what interventions are most critical for democratizing them and their policies?
I am increasingly leaning towards the position of um, people like my good friend, economist Marshall Steinbaum, work that has come out of the Roosevelt Institute, work from my colleagues at CTAP, among them Daniel Green, Shannon McGregor, Francesca Tripodi, and others, who are saying, given the historical sediments of how we do governance in the United States, because you always got to wrestle with that, right? We have to build on what is there. That the way forward for that is probably a combination of, yes, we need to revisit regulation, but we have got to have a public option to compete with
Mm,
private platforms.
mm,
That's it. There has to be we have been confused by the accessibility of privately owned platforms. They feel democratic, and they are in their democratic use. They are not democratic by control. So the way to counter private control but democratic access is with democratic control and democratic access. That's a public option, basically. That is a public internet, public infrastructure for public platforms. I think our governance should be restricted to those public internets and platforms so that we can extricate public governance from private control of platforms. I think we need a public internet.
It's interesting thinking. So that leads me to want to combine two questions into one. And to our audience, you're generating a lot of stuff, and I'm going to try my best to cycle through here as we go along because Tressie, your reactions and responses have really been enlightening. But a couple of you have taken the steps of including a very comprehensive literature review in the start of your question and answer. So it takes me a little while to kind of read through. So so between, I'm going to hybridize Shannon and Lisa's questions. So what you just talked about, we're talking about rural access to internet. We're talking about net neutrality a lot. And then Lisa raises the point that Europe has taken some very aggressive data privacy steps that are far beyond ours. And so as you think about this notion of having a public space to counterbalance all of the private spaces, even the public space is going to be limited in some ways. And so, how do you react to these questions about, how do we evolve our current structures? And, is Europe getting it right? Are they thinking about this correctly?
Yeah.
We need to catch up.
I do think that Europe exceeds us in that they are at least thinking about it. So whether or not they get it right or not, they are at least engaging with the questions on their own terms. And that's a place where we really haven't gotten. We really are still in the sort of performative politics stage, is where we drag Zuckerberg before, the Senate, and we do a little ritualistic beating, and then everybody goes back and retreats to their corners. This is why, again, the historical structure, though, matters. They can have that conversation in Europe because their historical sediments are built on a different relationship to the private sector. That's what I meant about how in the US, given what we inherited, our relationship and all of the the cases on which we would have to build for us to make the case for something like that amount of massive infrastructure spending has to reckon with our own history of our relationship to things like property, free speech, public speech, right? So we're going to have to deal with unless we want to rewrite all of that. And that's what I mean about why the historical antecedents always matter. Given that our best case scenario is a competitive public internet that has the government and municipal sphere as its dedicated client and investment vehicle, which is interesting to say because that is how the private internet started, right? We know how to do that. That's how we created the internet we have. So it's not like you'd have to kind of start from scratch. It would take some work, I think, at the infrastructure level of where it's governed. And it probably, yes, does mean creating sort of like some new layers of bureaucracy, but we would really be creating it into a vacuum where there has not been enough innovation and regulation and bureaucracy. That's the vacuum where platforms and platform capitalism has exploded. I think Europe does get right that they are trying to balance the rights of citizens against the profit of platforms. We don't have a code yet of the rights of citizens as it relates to data. It's actually one of our big primary challenges. Everybody from like the NAACP to the ACLU has been working on putting forward sort of a framework, but in the US, we still don't have an understanding of data being an extension of our personhood, despite the fact that that's how it's used. To rate us, sort us, et cetera. It is an extension of our personhood. And so we have to start with sort of like a framing of rights and responsibilities, because that's how you then get into a negotiation of the trade-offs between innovation, profit, and civil liberties. Right now, we can't even have a conversation because data isn't thought of as being part of the civil liberties conversation.
That I think as you talk there, Tressie, that we're in the midst here at Ohio State of reconfiguring our general education curriculum for the first time in 30 years. And so as we go forward, our new approach will have some of those things that we all think of as a general education, but our students will actually choose themes. Well, they'll choose a theme. There will be, in fact, one theme assigned to them. And the theme that will be common to all Ohio State students is citizenship for a just and diverse world.
Yeah.
And so as we think about that, I'm now thinking about a conversation that was embedded within the debate about how to change the gen ed. that actually talk. We have a digital flagship program currently where incoming freshmen and transfer students receive iPad devices and a set of tools on those so that everyone has access to technology. And I realize if we have some of those graduating seniors that you were envisioning as your audience listening in, they're immediately texting me to say, well, I didn't get mine, because we've gone through 3 cohorts. And so next year we will have actually completed the cycle.
Yeah.
And it's great to have that common technology. It actually turned out to serve us pretty well when we went into the virtual world. The thing that has been pointed out as a potential missing link is actually a course or experience where students learn about that relationship we were just talking about. My data are me.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. That's, to my mind, we call it critical data literacy or media literacies or whatever, but really, I think it is citizenship. It's, in K through 12, is social studies 101. If, that is why I think it's so important for us to understand platforms is not something that we visit from time to time, but as something that is the central organizing principle of society as we live it. If we understand it that way, you can't be a fully participating citizen without understanding that relationship. I was watching PBS NewsHour last night, and they were talking about the head of CISA was talking about data breaches and election machines and et cetera, and the security of our elections. And he made a point kind of offhand that I actually thought was really a good point. He said, I'm in favor of bringing back Schoolhouse Rock to teach the American public how elections now work, how the internet or data shapes that, and why you don't have an immediate feedback loop in some of these things. He said that he just thinks that there was like a real awareness gap. And in awareness gaps, that's where misinformation and disinformation and all of that flourishes. But like a public campaign, of which public universities should absolutely be at the heart, to teach people a common language about citizenship that understands this is what citizenship means now. I think it is both a project for your students, and that we should all be those students. We should all be learning those very things.
Yeah, I've always felt that great teaching actually is much learning for me as it is opining. And
oh, absolutely,
the best days are the days when it's actually flipped, and we're all learning together. And lots to do here. But I'm not going to let you escape this whole area about regulation and who owns what without. We've heard so much, maybe more than we would ever care to, about Section 230.
Yeah.
Any opinions about repealing that? I mean, I think that's a specific question, but it's part of a broader question about, is there hope of getting control? Or is it out of our hands? Because several people have asked, how do you choose a platform? Is there a platform that actually you have more control, or at least more transparency about what's happening? And
that's at least the right question, because then that leads you to the question of, why don't we have a choice among platforms, especially in a culture that frankly fetishizes consumer choice? Why don't we have these choices? And that's really what 230 was about. And you're going to get me in so much trouble because my colleagues are very energetically engaged in that debate. And my takeaway from it is this: that even if we got rid of 230, that the horses left the barn, so to speak, that we, that we have probably missed our moment to reshape the internet that we have, but that does not foreclose upon us reshaping. Like, there doesn't have to be, a single internet with a single point of entry and access. Like, those questions have now reopened, especially politically, just like in concrete terms, with a new administration who is ready to engage those kinds of questions. This is a moment when we can relitigate those things, and we probably should be.
One of the comment questions that's just come in here, again, I'm trying to keep a thread where I can, but there's so many different takes on how this looks that I think it's really entertaining to kind of explore the corners of the different topics here. But one of our guests today said, can you talk a little bit about platforms being leveraged for social change? For example, Black Lives Matter, the Me
Yeah.
Too movement.
Mhm.
How does that fit into this matrix of economic citizenship data?
Mhm. I'm going to shout out here work by Melissa Brown, a sociologist, um, who has done really amazing work about social movements and digital platforms and organizing. There's also a lot of work in sort of feminist sociology that does comparative global work, and some of the names are now about to escape me. I hate it when that happens. But so I don't want to understate the radical potential of connection, because that's fundamentally what platforms allow people to do, to leverage their networks, to enable do consciousness raising, and then eventually to enact some action. However, what we know from work that has emerged out of campaigns around Black Lives Matter, around Say Her Name, other campaigns that kind of start as consciousness raising and hashtags, et cetera, on social media sites and then are translated into platforms and actions, is that the surveillance potential of these platforms have in many cases outweighed the benefit of consciousness raising that the platforms engender. And that the trade-offs between how hyper visible do you want your social movement action to be, um, the challenge of doing that consciousness raising on a platform is that unlike traditional media, you can't control how the information is taken up. So a really important part of social movement work is drawing attention to it, trying to get the media and the cameras to show up. That's a whole job that people train to do, right? How to make a public spectacle so that people will pay attention. In traditional media, you could focus that message. The challenge on social media is that your reach may be greater and the cost of doing it may be lower. But here's our takeaway about the digital society: it's never free. It may be free to use, but it's never free. There's always a cost, there's always a price to be paid. And the price for that amplification effect is that you cannot control how that information is received, archived, and then triangulated and used. So we see the case, for example, of Black Lives Matter activists who, have been surveilled by using their social media data. One activist was found by a comment she made on an Etsy shop. Had been triangulated across different platforms. That's the power that is given platforms. Many of the platforms, I think all of them really, have shown themselves willing to work, by the way, with the police state to increase that surveillance, to turn over that data. Twitter sometimes pushes back, Facebook never pushes back. And so the many on the ground activists have found that that the cost is too high, right? And they don't have the sort of control over the message that they need to turn that amplification into people power. And so it's a really complicated issue, one where I think the private control of platforms becomes really evident, right? So there's no way for me as an empathetic party to Black Lives Matter activists to call up Twitter and and say I'm in solidarity with these activists, right? And so you targeting them is, a larger political project of which I'm complicit, and as a citizen, right, I want to lodge my complaint. There is no way for me to do that. Consumer boycotts don't have that effect because that's not how they really make money. And so there is no sort of like democratic way to participate in how those platforms use that data. And because of that, we can't even be good bystanders of the social movements that we believe in. And that to me is the troubling price we pay in the amplification value of social media platforms.
That the way you talk through that actually leads me to want to kind of, we're coming to a close with our time back and forth here. And so I'm just going to take a moment perhaps to ask a final question that comes from me. And you started with the reminder to all of us that data is the antecedent of the internet. It's not like suddenly we have the internet and there's facts.
Right,
Uh,
right.
Facts, opinions, whatever. They're little bits of information, maybe is the way we think about it. But that's as old as society itself
Mm-hmm.
in so many ways. And then here we've come back to the point where, in talking about how some of these social movements might actually interact with these new platforms, remembering that there have and always will be other platforms. We just haven't thought about them as synonyms
Mm-hmm.
across these different sorts of entities. But that one of the findings of some of these social movements is actually that the cost to them of using the new platforms is too high. What's the balance there, Tressie? You can't go home again, right?
Right.
How do you, and you said it with a couple of remarks on a couple of the different questions, that maybe the genie's out of the bottle on some of these things. Do you see a future where we figured out how to reconcile managing our facts? If you had to advise us, we're a major research university. We're collecting data on ourselves all the time. We've done 300,000 COVID tests.
Yeah.
And those data, while private, are all in our system.
Mm-hmm.
We know what courses students, and I can go on the Ohio State app and I can see my courses from 1972.
Mm-hmm.
We just have troves of data. And, what's our path forward? How do we reconcile this? You want a social movement that has a message to be able to use a platform that appropriately expands that message and gets the point across. You don't want them to hunker back down and say, well, I'm going to carve something into a stone here.
Right.
What's your advice to us as a learning, growing, researching place, and how we play a role with, finding this pathway and helping to balance all of these different demands?
I think one of the most important things we've learned in the sort of the chaos of mass information that digital technologies have produced is a renewed appreciation for the role of institutions. And I feel so awkward saying this. I'm trained in the critical sociological tradition. It feels fundamentally wrong to me to say that institutions might have a positive functional goal. I mean, I'm supposed to critique the institution. That's my job, right? But I do think that we have learned and seen firsthand, especially over the last month, what happens when the institution is devalued to the point of the margins of public life and civic life. Right? So it may not have been destroying the institution that needed to happen, but reworking the democratic controls and checks and balances of institutions. I suspect the way forward is in reconfiguring the tension between people, institutions, and representation, political representation. That when we've got it right, when all of those are healthy, right? Not perfect, because they never are. And we're always going to be tethered to some part of the history that made them. But when they are in a tension, equally robust, equally accessible, right? That's the best of plural democratic public life. That means the institution, if we want to bring it back to the role of something like a university, is to become as healthy and democratically controlled as it can be. And I always expand the imagination of democratic control beyond faculty governments, which I think is foundational to the health and well-being of public higher education. It is a bulwark against some of the excesses of profit taking and streamlining and disinvestment. We need it. But students also have to be partners in that. And the communities where the universities reside have to be partners in that. And I think a healthy institution shoring up the health of democratic debate and democratic governance is not only important for the health of the institution, but right now we need institutions to model how that is done, right? We need healthy models, and that's what I think we should double down on focusing on.
Well, you leave me feeling hopeful. I'll just tell you, tomorrow afternoon, about this time, our university, not faculty, university senate will be meeting. It's a combination of faculty, staff, student body, all our undergraduate, graduate, and professional students represented, and administrators, all voting members of this shared governance assembly. Ohio State does something that is really pretty unique in my experience in terms of shared governance. And we don't always agree among those constituents or even within them, but we have a way to have those discussions. And to your point, I think we have to model, even as we talk on Thursday nights about how to have different sorts of discussions in our everyday operations. We need to model these things, and we need to call out the things that still need a lot of work. You've left us a little space, not just around the edges, but square in the middle, the intersection. It's a geometry problem, and we're looking at the union of the sets here.
Nice.
In terms of the kind of things that we have to face as an institution that discovers ideas and disseminates those ideas. And the best way to do it, I think, is, as you've called out, be a model internally, be consistent in how we approach those, engage then further. And fortunately, as a land-grant institution, part of our DNA is actually to not just stay on campus with the thinking and discussions we do, but to be of the community, not just in the community. And I think that's really a critical point that we can carry forward from your presentation this afternoon. And so I thank you. I say to our audience, I told you at the start that this has been an exceptional series, and this would be no exception to the exceptional part. And I think we can all agree that we really have been challenged to think about some things today, both timely and timeless in the way that Tressie has explained them to us. To our audience who asked questions, thank you for the ones I can get to. To the several dozen people I didn't get to, my apologies. If you have friends who really ought to see and listen to today's thought exchange, we have recorded this, and it'll be available for you to share with all of your colleagues. Tressie, again, my thanks to you. You've held up the banner of excellence of this series. You've challenged us to think. You've sent us with homework. I think people are going to try to enroll in your class to figure out the question of Clubhouse and see where that all ends up. But more importantly than that, I think that you've demonstrated the value of exactly what we've tried to accomplish with our Discovery Theme initiatives here at the university. And that is, there are great ideas that emerge from a single discipline, but the true breakthroughs are where ideas crash together and people bring different disciplines and different ways of thinking and different subject matter. That's how the complex problems of society arise. That's how they'll be solved. And I think you've called our attention very squarely back to that. So to you, Tressie, thank you for your time with us. I have here on my homework, expects an invitation to campus.
Very good, Bruce.
We will work on that. I wrote that down immediately.
All your note taking, you had gotten that important note.
There is a star next to that one. And so you can count on that. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us today. Been another wonderful time in our Provost Discovery Theme series. And we'll look forward to the next adventure. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.